Today we are interviewing Paul A. Rothman in his lovely home in Denver, Colorado. Paul, who is now retired, was the president of the Fred B. Rothman and Company from 1985 until 1998, when it became a part of the William S. Hine Company. From 1998 until 2011, Paul operated what he describes as a hobby-like small company called Low-Dough Law Books. It specialized in used law monographs of a type mostly sold to newer law schools, which are still building that part of their collections. Paul, prior to joining what was at the time your father's company as vice president in 1967, you worked for several years as an attorney with a New York City law firm. Could you tell us a little bit about that era in your life, and perhaps a little bit about your education, and then how you decided to come into the company with your father?
Sure. Well, I guess after high school, I grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey, and I went to Swarthmore College. After college, I guess during college, I was a math major. I really enjoyed math, but by my senior year, it seemed there were no numbers left in math, and I started to lose interest. So in the final year, I became an economics major, and I thought about getting a PhD in economics and teaching. But I had always wanted to go to law school, and in the end, that won out. So I enrolled at the University of Michigan, and I really enjoyed the law school there. I was on the law review, and I met a professor that I really took to. I think that happens to a lot of people, and I became very interested in tax law, which has a numbers sort of element to it. I also had loved statistics in college, which most people despise. So anyway, I ended up being a tax attorney at Dewey Ballantine in New York City, and while I was doing that, I took courses at night at the NYU Law School graduate tax program. So eventually I got a master's, an LLM in taxation from NYU as well. And shortly after my several years at Dewey Ballantine, I did join Fred B. Rothman and Company, which was sort of one of the major decisions in my life. So maybe should I just go back to the beginning?
Well, why don't you? Why don't you talk a little bit about your life when you were young, and perhaps about your father and how he came to lead academic law librarianship and start the Fred B. Rothman Company.
Right, so my father was, I guess then they were known as law librarians, now library directors, but he was head of the library at the New York University School of Law from 1941 to 1945. And it was a really different time back then. He had a law degree, and most law librarians then did not. Also, there were many libraries where the librarian was really just somebody's secretary. So the profession was really just beginning to evolve back then. Anyway, by the end of the war, he felt he should either get a big raise or he was going to leave NYU and start this book business. And he felt really equipped to do that because he had lots of contacts in the field, and he loved books, and I guess it was something he wanted to do. So I guess I was about 5 years old in 1945, and I'm sure I didn't hear this firsthand, but years later I would hear from my mother's family about when Fred decided to take this step. My mother would say to her brothers and sisters, I really don't know how we're going to eat. But when she spoke to him about it, he sort of poohed it, and it would work out somehow or other. So I think the first thing to know about my father is that he was a risk taker, and I think that really passed on to me as well. So in 1945, the book business was very, very different. This was before the era of short-term reprinting. There were no computers, nothing like that. So basically his business was going out among the librarians he knew, buying things that they didn't want, their duplicates, trying to put together bits and pieces from various places, and then selling what he had put together to another library. And the biggest part, I think, of our business at that time was the back issues of law reviews. So for example, let's say if someone wanted to purchase a complete back run of the Harvard Law Review, they were hard to find, and there were lots of people who wanted them. So the trick was to be able to put the stuff together, and then you had basically customers fighting over who would get the one set. And as time went on, that world got sort of totally flipped over, because as soon as short-run reprinting came in the 50s, the name of the game now was to get the rights to the journal from the journal. Then you could reprint as many copies as you wanted, and the name of the game now became how many libraries could you find to buy that title. So I guess my early recollections of the business were, I guess, we lived in Brooklyn. My mother was from Brooklyn, and my father was from the Bronx. And I guess on Saturday mornings, I think as early as perhaps the age of 7, my father would take me to work with him on Saturday. And he had started out in a small shop on Bleecker Street in downtown Manhattan, Greenwich Village. And he then moved to a slightly larger facility on Canal Street. And Canal Street was the dividing line between Little Italy and Chinatown. So basically the hook to get me interested in this business was I was invited to come work on Saturdays, and I would then get my choice of whether we would eat lunch in Chinatown or Little Italy. And those were two very nice choices, and I really enjoyed that. So I started out, I think the first thing I did was type labels. So from an early age, I really knew that library was Library. I would never spell it Libary, as some people have tended to say it. And my next chore, which I thought was a big step up in my development, is I was put in charge of collating sets of back issues of law reviews. And some of these law reviews were really easy. So if you would take a set like the University of Chicago Law Review, it was a quarterly from day one to forever. And my job was to find a copy of issue 1, 2, 3, and 4 of volume 1 and rubber band them together, and they could then be ready for binding. And if in any volume I was missing an issue, I had to make a note of that. That was pretty simple. The height of my skill, I think, was when I was allowed to work on the American Journal of International Law. And that I felt at the age of 7 or 8 was a real challenge, because generally it was a quarterly, but many volumes, especially in the early years, had a supplement. And then there were also volumes that had a special supplement. So I felt this was really, people were showing trust in my ability by allowing me to deal with a set like that. So let me go back again a little bit to my personal life. My father being from the Bronx, my mother from Brooklyn, and we were living in Brooklyn. Everyone was a Dodger fan where we lived, except my father, being from the Bronx, was a big Yankee fan. And of course I was a Yankee fan. So we were always at odds with everyone else. And of course in those days, the Yankees were pretty dominant. The Dodgers could make it to the World Series, but it took them quite a while to get any further than that. So that was sort of, I think, a source of pleasure for us, but also expressed a little bit of my father's personality. He always liked to take the other side whenever there was a discussion or an argument. So this really fit very well with his personality. And the other thing I remember from those really early days was we lived in a Jewish community in Brooklyn, and I would say at least 99.8% of the people were Democrats, and my father was a Republican. So I remember in 1952, when Eisenhower defeated Stevenson for president, one of my friend's mothers came over to my father and she said to him, "Fred, I don't know anybody who voted for Eisenhower except you. How did he possibly win?" And my father really thought that was a really good commentary on people and how they think about the world. So getting back to the business, in the early days, my mother would work while my sister and I went to school, and she would come home about 3 o'clock so she could be there when we got home. And it was really a family affair. And as time went on, I guess she stopped worrying about whether we would eat or not. And I also remember one year when I was a teenager, I guess my father came home and he told me that this was the first year that we had earned $10,000. And it was like he was a rich man. It was the most incredible thing. And so you think back of what inflation has done over 60 years. But back then, $10,000 probably was a quite princely sum. So then my earliest really contacts with librarians were attending the AAL conventions and also seeing how they changed over the years. And I think I've gone probably to as many as anybody, because most people probably started attending their first convention at perhaps age 28 or something like that. But I attended my first convention at the age of 11. And the conventions back then and now are just like day and night, as is the whole profession, I would guess. So in the early meetings, there were perhaps 300 to 400 people. People tended to know each other very well and almost know everybody. And it was a very personal type thing. The social events were held in vendors' suites rather than in big public rooms. And things were, quite different than they are now. So my earliest memories of these meetings, I remember playing horseshoes with Miles Price at the Colorado Springs meeting in 1957 at the Flying W Ranch. And if I'm not mistaken, that ranch was putting on these sort of cowboy-type dinners from that point until last year when there was a big fire in Colorado Springs and I think it was destroyed. I also, at all these conventions in my teenage years, played golf in what was called the Canadian-American Golf Tournament. And that was great fun. So the American side was represented by me and Marion Gallagher. And each year the Canadian side was represented by George Johnston, who I believe was with the Law Society of Upper Canada, I might be wrong. And his partner was Bill Gaunt, who was then with Carswell. And to give you an idea of what the meetings were like and the size and whatnot, at every annual dinner, the final dinner at the convention, they would announce the winner of this golf tournament. Also, these conventions, I think, had a tremendous impact on my future life because the 1957 convention was held at the Antlers Hotel in Colorado Springs. So I was 17 years old, probably a senior in high school at the time. And so my mother and father and I came to Colorado, and while my father worked, my mother and I did a little sightseeing, and I remember one day we rented a car and a driver, and he took us up into the mountains in Cripple Creek, and we drove around. And when that meeting was over, I told my father that sometime down the road I was going to leave the East Coast and move to Colorado. And that turned out to be a lifelong dream of mine that eventually came to pass. And I guess we'll get to that a little later. So maybe I'd just say a few things about my life today. I have two girls, Deborah and Diana. Debbie is a physical therapist. She works at the hospital in Boulder with young kids who have physical problems. I have my younger daughter, Diana, was just married a year and a half ago, and she trains horses and gives people lessons and things like that. And she and her husband, just within the last several months, bought 40 acres of land, nice flat grassland, and they hope someday when they can accumulate some money to build a house there and a barn and an indoor arena, and that she could really develop her business that way. So that's an exciting thing for us to watch. My wife Carol Ann and I, we were married in 1999. We met in 1993, and I guess that was after I was divorced about 2 years before that in 1991. And I lived up in Evergreen, which is at 8,000 feet, about 3,000 feet above Denver in the mountains, and she lived in a suburb of Denver, and we sort of had to decide, where we would live, and we thought about perhaps building a log cabin and living in the mountains, or coming downtown, and in the end we decided on moving down here to the city, and that's really been a great decision for us. So we live in an old building, early 20th century. It's all brick and has really high ceilings, and for many, many years it was the refrigerator building for the railroad. So we're 1 block from Union Station and right in front of the railroad tracks. So farmers would come to this building with their milk and produce and dairy products, whatnot, and they would be stored in this building, which primarily was just this huge refrigerator, and then things would come on and off the train. And of course, as the years passed, in the 50s and 60s, with trucking and air and whatnot, the railroads sort of dwindled in this area, and the ice house was finally abandoned as an ice house. And it sat idle for a while. It was then turned into a design center, and in 1998 it was converted to residences. So we really like it here. We're in the heart of the city, and I think especially for people in our age group, Denver's just a great place. That we have lots of sunshine. People think of it as being cold here, but really we don't get that much bad weather in the winter. It's dry. It's a great place to live. But what's really nice being in the city at our age is that Denver is about 1.5 miles in length, and then the downtown is a few blocks on either side. And down 16th Street there's a free shuttle that runs every minute or two, except in the evenings when it's maybe every 5 minutes. And so you can leave your home and hop on this free shuttle, and pretty much the whole of downtown is all within walking distance. So we all do have cars, but you can go for a week perhaps without getting into your car. And then of course we have all the advantages of the city. The theater district is right here. We're just 1 short block from Coors Field, the baseball stadium. It's about a 5, 6, 7-minute walk to the Pepsi Center, where the hockey and basketball pro teams play. And although I used to, when we first came here, walk to the football games, it took about a half hour. I then started going by bike, and now I'm down to taking the light rail. So time marches on. My wife is a retired school teacher, and so we're both retired and really enjoying life down here. We've gotten involved in community affairs, and the one thing that's been our big project the last 10 years is that through the Lower Downtown Neighborhood Association, we've been in charge of trying to build a playground in the downtown area. And so over the last 10 years, we've spent all that time designing playgrounds, raising money, and that playground finally opened to the public in 2007. Some little improvements were added a year later, and now the final feature, which really we're excited about, it's a stone interactive water feature uh, that's sort of unique. Perhaps you could call it a work of art, and that will be installed within the next month. So I think we've raised all the money for this playground except for a few $1,000s. We're just about done with the fundraising. So what we'll have is this huge rock. It started out as a 35-ton boulder, which was unearthed when they built a Walmart near Vail, and it came by truck to Denver. Then went to a saw shop where it was cut into 3 pieces, and then an artist has drawn or carved channels into it, and it has a little pump. So the child goes up to the pump, or the parent does, and they pump the water, and it runs through all these channels, and the kids play with it, and as the water hits the rock, it changes from gray to pink. It's really quite a fascinating thing. So that's been something that's really kept us occupied for quite a while. So do you have any questions to
Well,
lead
I'm
me on?
fascinated letting you just sort of go on and sort of fill in all these things in your background. I do have one question though. Some years ago, your father and the company were from New York, and they were headquartered back there, and yet he decided, I guess he was still the president, to bring it out here to Colorado. And that's when you all moved. I mean, you said earlier that you had aspired to move
Right.
out here since you were a kid and
Right.
been out here. And I can see why, looking around at the Rockies and all the snow on them and the distance and everything today. It's beautiful country. But how did that happen to come about? Because your father's competitors, such as they were generally back in that part of the country, except maybe for Bill Gaunt, who was at that point had left Carswell
Had gone to
at his
Florida,
own place
right.
down in Florida.
Right.
How did you happen to? How did the Rothman company
Right.
happen to decide to move out to Littleton, Colorado?
So I guess our first move, and this was a very difficult time in our family. In 1954, I believe it was, we moved from New York to New Jersey. So that was the old famous address, 57 Looning Street, South Hackensack, New Jersey.
I remember
and we
that.
always, yeah, got a kick out of that we published some books with, I believe it was Sytoff and Sweet and Maxwell, and so the line on the title page was London, Leiden, and South Hackensack. My father got a real kick out of that. So anyway, I guess we moved to New Jersey because we had to. We just needed more room. So the business had really changed in those first 10 or so years from buying and selling used pieces and putting them together to going about and getting reprint rights to law journals. And so we had, I think, in the end, perhaps the reprint rights to all the back issues of perhaps 200 law reviews. And we had all the, not all, but I'd say 16 of the 20 best. So we had the Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Virginia, Texas, California, Stanford, Chicago, Northwestern. Lots and lots of good ones that were also quite old. And that took lots and lots of storage space. And it was, impossible, first of all, to move the stuff in and out right in the middle of Manhattan, but also would have cost a fortune to have, that kind of warehouse space right in the heart of the city. So sometime about 53, when I was about 12 or 13, my father, I assume, started looking for space somewhere outside the city, and he found this place in South Hackensack, and we were to move there. And I guess two just really terrible things, one more terrible than the other, happened right at that time. So we ended up moving in June, and the prior December, my sister, who was a year younger than I, was diagnosed with leukemia, and within 3 weeks, I would say, she was gone. And so she was diagnosed in December, so all this took place over the holidays, and then lo and behold, she died in early January on my mother's birthday. So, I mean, this was just, just devastating to all of us. And I think, for my mother, I would say was never really the same after that. And it was just a terrible emotional time, and I think my mother just couldn't, come to grips with it, and my father wanted to sort of move on, sort of the traditional male-female type of reacting to things like that, and it really made a profound change in our life. And I guess one of the things that really touches me is I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, which is also a blood cancer, back in 2006. And I guess, first I went to the family doctor and kept moving along to various experts. And when I finally got to the myeloma expert, he interviewed me, and of course one of the questions he asked was whether I had any family history of cancer. And he said that what my sister had, she could have been cured today. And I guess it even breaks me up now to think about it or talk about it. So this was now almost 60 years later. And it just seemed like, wow, such a waste, a whole life, and how, it changed our family and the whole family dynamic. And what's also been interesting about the multiple myeloma that I have, in the 1990s, it was pretty much considered a death sentence. By the year 2000, they were keeping people alive an average of 3 years. And when I was diagnosed, they were talking about maybe the life expectancy was 6 years. And now I've had it for over 6 years. And just in the last year, they've come online with 2 new drugs that have been approved by the FDA. And people are talking about, they really can't be sure, but they think maybe the life expectancy now is 10 years. And there's even talk about, we could get to the point where we could maybe keep people alive, and it would just be a matter of, managing their symptoms. So it's sort of interesting to juxtapose the situation that my sister was in and that I'm in, and the amazing things that medical science has done and is doing. So for me, life goes on. I had a stem cell transplant in 2008, and I had a really tough year, and I've had a couple hospitalizations due to infection. But really now for a year and a half, things have been good. I go for chemotherapy on Wednesdays 2 out of 3 weeks, and the side effects are quite minor, and you just hope for the best and watch those researchers, So it's a terrible thing, and you look at what's happened positive, it's just a different world. So the other thing that happened to my dad, as soon as he moved to New Jersey, this was in South Hackensack, out came plans to build Interstate 80, which is the big interstate that runs basically from a few miles outside of New York City all the way to either Sacramento or San Francisco.
I think it goes into San Francisco.
Does it really? Yeah. But I know Davis, California is one of the last exits before the terminus. Anyway, there were 3 routes, and it turned out that one of the routes would have taken his new building, which would have been really difficult to move all those books and then have to do it again. But that never happened. They chose one of the other routes, and I guess at times we used to joke with Mort Schwartz, who became the first law librarian in Davis, California, that if someone wanted directions from our place to his, all you had to do was take a left out of our parking lot, take a right onto I-80, go 2,900 and some miles, and get off at exit number so-and-so, and you'd be right there at the law school. So that was our first move, and my father used to joke about that later on, that he started moving west back in 1954, because to a born and bred New Yorker, New Jersey was the wilderness. And I guess really moving to Colorado was all my idea and something that he really thought was insanity. Um, so I guess we moved in 1978, and I would say about 5 years before that, we knew we had terribly outgrown the facility in South Hackensack, and we had to move. And my father and I would go about looking for places, and his object was to find some place nearby to move to. And my object was to find something wrong with every one of these places. And as time went on, he got older, and sort of the balance of powers would start to shift. So when we actually moved to Colorado, he was almost as old as I am now. And I think although he didn't retire until 4 or 5 years later, the move to Colorado was really a changing of the guard, and he sort of, I think, in a sense, gave up and said, "Oh, hell, you can do whatever you want," So in the past, my father, he loved to argue, and he was a debater in college, and if he wanted to discuss something, he would take one side and you would take the other, and if you didn't disagree vehemently enough, he was very upset, and then he would want to take your side and put you on the other side. And also, one of the things I remember about him was when I was really young and working with him, and we would have to make a decision. It seemed to me he could just decide something right off the bat without really doing any analysis or crunching the numbers or whatnot. And where I would always want to go back and do a real analysis. And it amazed me how often we came out to the same conclusions. And in the end, I came, I think, to sort of understand that I had to go through this numeric process, but he had this sort of background, and somehow from the pit of his stomach, he could just decide these things and seem to always come out right, or at least a great percentage of the time. So he really had, I think, a gift in that area. And one of the things I noticed, as he approached, let's say, getting past 70, this pit of your stomach had too much old information in there, and the world was changing, and his judgments in that area were not as good. And another thing I noticed was, here was this guy in 1945 who was willing to risk starvation to do what he wanted to do. He was gradually becoming, more and more conservative, and sort of looking at things about, well, gee, I've done well, and I have all of this. I have to be careful not to lose it all now. And I guess, I didn't really like that at the time. But now that I've reached his age, I see that I'm doing the exact same thing. So, like when young people come to me, especially my children or Carol Ann's children, and they think about, well, should we start this business or that business? I always think they're all too risky, which is really strange. I guess another thread that I'd like to throw in was, I always felt really badly that my father really, he took the exciting risks, and he built his success after getting past that initial level. And everything that he did, all I could do was make it maybe a little better or a little bigger. But I always really felt it was, his business. So when we moved to Colorado, I guess that was the real turning point. And he sort of, from then on, pretty much let me do what I wanted to do. And within another, I guess, 5 or 6 years, he did fully retire. So to just go to the move was extremely difficult, because at the time we had about 50 employees. And, I had my heart set on moving. And you really couldn't do it if you couldn't get anybody to come with you. And so, for example, back then, Harry Bittner was creating the green slips for the green slip service. And his daughter lived in the New Jersey area, and he didn't want to come. And, you know, I needed at least some core. I couldn't just go out there myself and hire 50 people and train them and try to keep the thing afloat and going. I think the real tipping point came when Dick Spinelli decided that he would move to Colorado. And I think that was a real difficult decision for him, because both he and his wife Arlene were from New Jersey, and all their family was there. But I think he really enjoyed working with us, and enjoyed our company and what we did, and he finally decided to come. And we also had a shipping clerk, a cousin of mine, a filing person. I think in all we had maybe 10 or 12 people who moved. And I mean, the transition was incredibly difficult. So that we moved out on June 13th, 1978, which was like 3 weeks before the AAL annual convention, which was supposed to be held in Manhattan, but some reason got moved to Rochester. And we were determined, Dick and I and my father, to go to that meeting because it would show that, you know, we were up and running, sort of. But when we got to Colorado, we had this very small group of people, and we had all these people we had hired before we came out, and we sort of had this choice. Should the people who knew what to do get some work done, or should we teach the others so that they could get something done? And I guess we did a little of both, and after a while, you know, we sort of got up to speed. And I think my father, who really, you know, he had no desire really to move to Colorado, but when he got here, it was like his new home, and he was proud of it. And I really vividly remember how he would talk to people like Julius Mark and say, gee, you know, in 1954 I started moving west, and this was just a culmination of that move. You know, he had moved to New Jersey and now to Colorado. And the other thing I remembered that really blew his mind is when he would tell his friends back east, you know, I was talking to somebody here in Denver, and they started talking to me about back east in Kansas City. And he said, wow, that really blew my mind. And he also talked about the difference between here and there in the definition of the Midwest. So in Denver, the Midwest was Kansas City. And in New Jersey, the Midwest was Michigan and Ohio. And it wasn't that a strange thing. So I think he was proud to move here, but you know, in the end, he was just an onlooker, sort of cheering us all on.
Now, you've talked about the changes in the company, and you've mentioned changes in the AAL annual meeting. I remember many years, one of the real highlights there was the dance after the banquet.
Right.
That used to be at the end of the...
Which we sponsored, and then we'd
you
have
and
our
your
reception.
father and mother served as hostesses every year for that, and it was really quite a treat. But there were also a lot of other things going on. You moved the company west, but the law book industry was changing as well.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit about perhaps the law book industry that your father was more part of than you were? I'm thinking of you know, some of the other companies like
Right,
Oceana.
So first, let me just comment on the conventions. I guess in the early days when I was a kid, well, first of all, the conventions were held at the end of June instead of in July, and my birthday was on June 26th. And so my birthday was always at the AALL convention. And the parties that we had would be receptions in our suite. And everybody would be invited because there weren't that many people. And so I sort of remember the old days where, you know, one of my jobs was to wash out the glasses in the tub so that we'd always have enough glasses. I also remember one year when Morris Maxwell of Sweet and Maxwell brought a bottle of champagne for my birthday. and I didn't know anything about how to open a bottle of champagne, so I was down there leaning over the cork,
Oh.
and poor Mr. Maxwell, who was a very, elegant type of guy, I mean, he was just afraid I was going to blow my head off. But then in later years, yes, we sponsored the banquets after the dances after the banquets, and most receptions were held, in public rooms. But also in the later years, we would have excursions. I remember like one year when the convention was at the Hilton Hotel in New York, we had an event where we took everybody who subscribed to the Green Slip Service to the stage delicatessen, and from there to a Yankees baseball game. So it was a very personal thing, and I think I should also mention my mother. I think she was just, the perfect social wife at that time, and she would get to know all the new people, and I think people at AALL just loved my mother. And in later years, she couldn't do that, but at the beginning, she was a real presence of our presence at the AALL meetings. Now, we want to talk about the industry and how it's changed and some of the characters.
I think that would be fascinating to many of our colleagues. I mean, there have been a lot of changes in the law book industry since the time when your father started his company, and the newer people probably think the changes tend to be Thompson buying West, but there were a lot of changes long before that. And your father was part of those changes and part of that era. And you were, at least vicariously growing up, you must have known some of these people. Could you tell us a little bit about the law book industry? I don't really mean the big West Publishing Company or the Lawyers Co-op, but the others, like Phil Cohen's Oceana, Fred Dennis and Company, Bill Hines Company, some of those. Could you talk a little bit about some of that era and some of those individuals, perhaps, a little bit?
Right, so I think really there were two distinct parts to the law book industry. One were the big companies like West and Lawyers Co-op and Bender, who sold primarily to lawyers and secondarily to libraries, law school libraries. And there were the smaller book dealers like Dennis, Hine, us, Oceana, later Gaunt, who sold almost exclusively to the law school library market. So the first, and I'd say the bigger companies were more like corporate types, and the law book dealers were all characters and individuals, okay? So we'd start out with Fred Dennis, and I don't know everything, but I'm guessing he started in the 30s, and if I'm not mistaken, he sold law stationery originally, but he got into the law book business. And he was really the first one to do reprinting and stuff like that. And he had a tremendous organization. He traveled all the time, but his wife took care of the insides. I think usually the way companies like that turn out is you have a great salesman, and then they sort of foul up everything on the inside. But he had both covered until basically his wife passed away. And it was a really different time then. So librarians, for the most part, were not really professional people. And I think Fred Dennis sold by means of, I don't want to slander anybody, but I would say bribery and intimidation were perhaps his strong suits. So, he traveled extensively. He showered people with gifts and expensive dinners. And especially for the librarians who had the least amount of training, he would come in and basically pound on the table and say, I have sold this set to so-and-so and so-and-so, and they know more than you do, and you have to have it. And there were people who either would refuse to see him or who dreaded him coming. But whatever you say about him, he was very, very good at what he did. And he was not sort of happy to see the rest of us arrive to sort of cut into his turf somewhat. So the next in line that I think of is Bill Hine Sr., Bill Hine Jr.'s father. And he, as it turns out, was Fred Dennis's nephew. And he worked for Dennis and Company. And after some period of time, he felt that, Fred would never pay him a living wage, and he was not properly appreciated. And they had a tremendous blow up, and Bill Hine started his own business. And I think basically the model that he followed was the Dennis model of wine and dine the customer, and get the order any way you can. And I'd say he wasn't sort of intellectually attuned to what he was selling. And so then I think around 1945, both my father and Phil Cohn came along. And so we competed directly with Hine and Dennis, because it was the secondhand sets, mostly domestic type sets, and then we fought over who would get the rights to what law journals. And Phil Cohn was a little bit off on the side in that he concentrated most heavily on international and comparative law, and he sold more heavily outside the country than any of the three of us back then. So he would take long trips to Africa, and he would come back, and I remember he would tell people, "Oh, I was in Africa for 4 months and I sold $1 million worth of law books and this and that," and then he would have a conversation with my father, and he would say, "Oh, Fred, I'm telling everybody I sold $1 million in Nigeria or something, and just between you and me, it was only 400,000. And then my father would come to me and say, "Well, Phil told me this. Do you think he sold 100,000? And so he was a bit of a character in his own way. And so I guess what happened was Dennis just went on and on. I think he lived into his 90s, and he never stopped. His wife passed away, and he got to the point where he couldn't travel anymore, but he still had the rights to a number of titles. And he had a man who worked for him in the shipping department. And so, for example, if a new library started, a law school, and we got the order for all the law reviews, you had to go to Dennis to get the ones that he had. And he would call up this fellow, and he'd come in, and they'd pack up what you needed and sell it to you. But he wasn't, really out there anymore. Also, I remember from the early days that Dennis would come to visit my father, and he wanted to buy some of the things my father had, and my mother just hated these trips. And so my father would tell me what he did was he would salt the shelves with some good things, and then when Fred Dennis would come, he would want to buy them, and he would pay whatever he had to, and my father would just refuse to sell those things to them, and they would have these tremendous shouting matches, and my mother would just quiver back there. She couldn't stand it, and this was sort of the game they played. So then as Dennis grew older and older and less of a picture in the competition, basically as law libraries really proliferated in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we and Hine pretty much went head to head trying to get these orders. And I know, I myself, I did not like Hine Sr. and the way he did business. And it was very difficult for me to deal with somebody like that. So I think one of the really big changes that I've seen is Mr. Hine Sr. Died at a relatively early age, and Bill Hine Jr. sort of was thrust into leading that company, I think, before he was ready, and probably before he thought he was ready. And I think it must have been a really difficult time for him. And I'm really proud of what I see happen to that company, that I think, Bill really still needed more training when his father passed away, and yet he did what he could. And over the years, he's really hired good people. He's kept up with the technology. I think it's incredible what he's achieved. And so from, let's say, the 60s or 70s until today, I would say, I didn't like the Hine people. I didn't really respect the way they did things. And now it's been totally turned around. I'm really in awe almost of what Bill Jr. has accomplished. And in terms of the time we spent together with our purchase and sale and how he's treated me afterwards, I consider us to be really good friends now. So that's a real plus, I think, of what's happened over time. So in probably 97, Bill and I got together, and the thought was that it would be hard for us to survive in this time of mergers, as small as we were compared to the people around us. And so we talked about, somehow combining. And it turned out to be difficult for me because when it all sort of got put together, they were somewhat bigger than we were. And my whole upbringing had been one of the worst things in the world you can ever do is be a minority partner in a closely held business. And at that time, I was, I think, 58 or 59 years old. And by then, I knew neither of my daughters was interested in continuing this business. And I sort of made the decision that it was better to sell your company to someone who really wanted to buy it and would pay a fair price than to wait around till 65, which was my original plan, and then have to go looking and hope that you might find somebody who was interested in it. So that's how that sale came about. And also, I think what was very interesting is, the world had really changed. So all these law reviews that both of us had reprinted, we were now in the process of throwing them out, basically. So you might have had, at one point, you reprinted 200 sets of the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, and then a number of years later, you threw them out down to 50 sets, and then you threw it out down to 20 sets. And I remember I visited the Hine Company a number of years after the merger, and they had 2 people working full-time, and all their job was to throw out stuff from the warehouse. So after the sale, I always was sort of the opinion, wow, in some ways I sold a business that was going to die to Bill, and it was really a good deal for me. But in the end, it turned out to be a really good deal for both of us, because what happened was, when Dennis died, his law review titles went to Hine because he had no place else to give them. Okay, and then let's say Hine had half and I had half. And so by Hine acquiring our company, he now had all the law reviews. And that was really the beginning of Hine Online. And I think that probably represents, I don't know, but a huge percentage of what his business is today. It's certainly not selling hard copy.
Well, it's certainly a fantastic product. I mean, I can sit in my den in Olympia, Washington, and I have access to this
Everything,
huge wealth of all that literature, all the niche publications that both your companies published over the years, such as the AELL publication series, and it's just unbelievable and how rapidly this has all come about.
And those law reviews, I think, were a big part of the beginning of Hine Online.
Yes.
And what would it have been if you could say, well, here are half the law reviews?
Would have been less than half the product.
Right, exactly. And so I think in the end, it's what makes a good deal. It's when it's good for both sides, and I think that's what it turned out to be. So another just thing I'd like to mention about Bill Hine that I and one of the reasons I feel so close to him is, so after I sold Fred B. Rothman and Company to Hine, I was only 59 years old, and I was really, or maybe 58, I was really afraid of just, giving it all up and not having much to do. And we had this little bit of Fred B. Rothman and Company. It represented 0.5% of our sales, where we bought used monographs about law and sold them to newer libraries that had nothing in that field. So I asked Bill if it would be okay if we could exclude that from the non-compete. And I knew he didn't give a hoot about that stuff, and he said that was fine. So I set up this company called Lodo Law Books, and if you recall, we live right here, and a block away is Union Station. So I rented a little office in Union Station, and I started buying and selling these used books. And it was really great fun for me, because Carol Ann and I traveled, and whenever we traveled, I would go to all the local bookstores that didn't specialize in law. And you'd always find a little law section. Sometimes 3 shelves, sometimes a half a shelf, sometimes maybe 20 shelves. But none of these people had any knowledge whatsoever about law books. So you might find a book 4 years old on how to draw a will, and they would think, wow, that's valuable. There's people out there who need to know how to draw a will. So they'd offer that out. It was maybe a $20 book, and they'd be selling it for $10. But they might have some, old book on legal history or jurisprudence, and they would just say, my God, nobody will ever buy this. So that book went for $1. And so basically I would go to these stores, and I would find all these underpriced treasures, and then I would sell them, at a reasonable price, which was a lot more than $1, to newer libraries that didn't have any of this type of material. And I enjoyed it. It was fun finding the books, and it was also very different from running Fred B. Rothman and Company, because as time went on, we got bigger and bigger, and the parts that I really loved, the books, I more became a businessman. And here I went back really to the very beginning. I bought the books, I sold the books, I wrapped them and took them to the post office. The only helper I had was Carol Ann's daughter, who would fill in for me when we went on vacation. She would ship the orders. And so I really enjoyed that. And then when I got sick and had that transplant in 2008, it's sort of, I think, when people are taking things away from you, you don't want to let go. And it became my goal to keep that little business running. But there was no way that I could go out and travel and buy the books. And so at that time, Hine sent me this huge list of books like that in their inventory, which of course by then they had really not much interest in, I guess. And we made a deal that I could buy whatever I wanted for $5. So I remember sitting in my hospital room, and I had this hundreds of pages of lists of books, and I was really weak. I couldn't do very much, but I would go through a page at a time, and I picked out all these books. And it's really hard to pick them out as well from a list than from looking at them. So I bought many, I'd say, that I wouldn't have bought otherwise. But I bought enough that I was able to keep this business going. And then also when I recovered from the transplant, I couldn't lift anything or do anything physical. And I had a friend who had the beginnings of Alzheimer's. And I mean, it was the funniest thing in the world. He would come and help me. And we had the two of us, and I could, think and decide what to do. And he could grab the book and put it in the box and carry it to the post office. And it was just, it was a very special friendship, in that we each were like half a person, and together we could be a whole person. And to this day, I still go and I have lunch with him every week, and we play cards and whatnot, and it allows his wife to, he's much worse now, but it allows his wife to get out and do some things. So I think that's been special. But then later, I visited at the Hine Company, and I wanted to buy some more books, and I went in the back and I picked out what I wanted, and he wouldn't let me pay for them, and he wouldn't let me pay for the shipping. He just shipped all those books to me, and I just think he was just a really kind and gracious human being. So I'd say that the Hines, for my estimation, went from one end of the spectrum to the other in perhaps 30, 40 years. And that's a nice thing, I think.
No, it's nice also that Bill has a son in the business, and I've noticed in dealing with the company that there are a lot of father-son pairs within that company. And I think I see
Right, because
the
I think Kevin
transition
Marmion,
underway to the next generation.
right, I think Kevin Marmion's son is involved
Yes,
also.
he is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, from my perspective, very nice to see it actually happen. And
Right.
having come in to the profession, not quite as early as you did, I was a tad bit old, somewhere in my 20s, I would never have been able to predict which of the companies would survive and what would have happened in the law book industry. I wouldn't, of course, have predicted the consolidation of the really big places
Right,
either.
I know. Or the technology. I
Or
mean,
the
it's a
technology,
whole
and
different world.
It's just, it's been one heck of a interesting ride, and it sounds like you, Paul, have been all part of this as much as any of us, maybe.
Yes, I've seen a lot of it. So just a couple other things I'd like to add. I don't think I have much more to say, but I graduated from Teaneck High School in New Jersey in 1958, and Dick Spinelli graduated from Teaneck High School 1 year later in 1959, and we didn't know each other. And I went off to college and law school and whatnot, and he went to college, and then he worked for Johnson & Johnson, and then my father hired him, so he worked for us for many years. And then, as you know, his wife Arlene died of cancer, and that really turned his life upside down. And I guess we got to a point where Dick wanted to travel all the time because he had Mary at AAL headquarters in New York, who he eventually, in Chicago, who he eventually married. And we really needed someone to travel a little part of the time, but really to run the inside. And it became a very sort of difficult situation. And it seemed like, you know, it could have no good resolution. And eventually Dick went out and he got a job at Hine, and he left us. And I think it was good for everybody that basically, you know, we could not give him what he needed, and he could find it over there. And so, I mean, Dick has been a real force in our profession, and was a wonderful employee for us. And I think, God, he's probably been at Hine every bit as long now, certainly over 20 years at both places. So I think he's a very special person, and of course he's involved in all these interviews. So that's one thing.
It's been wonderful getting to know him even better by being asked to be part of this.
Right, and he and I just,
history
you know,
project.
despite that, which could have been a real schism in our relationship, we've always remained good friends. I think that's something very special.
That's good.
And then there's just one more thing I'd like to mention, unless you have more questions, is when I watched my father at the very beginning, and I saw all the excitement and the, you know, sort of the risk and what went on at the beginning to make sure it would survive and prosper. When I came in, there was no opportunity for stuff like that. I could make it bigger and I could make it better, but if I did something that didn't work, well, we just lost a little money and we picked up and moved forward. And I think I had some of the sort of feeling of, you know, the son having that, well, really, I didn't earn it as much as he did. So we moved to Colorado in 1978, and shortly thereafter, I built an addition onto the warehouse. And shortly after that, the world tipped. And from then on, you needed less warehouse space, not more warehouse space. So the book company never occupied all of that space in the new warehouse. And I rented a big part of it to these three men who started a business manufacturing credit cards. And they had three men. One provided the money, one was supposed to make the credit cards, and one had all the contacts with the banks to get the orders. And it seemed like a real natural.
Mhm.
And they started out and they did really well for quite a while, and then they started to have problems. First they didn't have enough capital, but most importantly, the guy who was manufacturing the cards was really a dud. And I guess it all came to a head. Back then, you have to be old, I guess, to remember this, but the Visa cards, every bank's Visa card was the same, and they were three stripes. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
There was a blue stripe, a yellow stripe, and a white stripe. They were really relatively easy to make. But this fellow had real trouble holding to the exact colors. And he once got into a situation where he just couldn't afford to throw out all these cards. So what he did was he ended up sorting them into boxes. So he had a box where the blue was a little too blue, and another box where the blue was just right, and another box where the blue was a little too light. And they got caught doing that, and pretty much it was all downhill from there. So in the year while they were my tenant, they were always looking for more financial backing, and they wanted me to invest in the company. And so I took an interest in it, but I realized it was, with these three, it was just a disaster. And well, eventually they went broke, and I bought that company from the bank, and the man who was running our short-run printing operation, we taught how to make the cards. And we provided the money, and we kept the guy who knew all the banks. And so this company started to prosper, but it was just the opposite of the book company. The book company, you publish something, and especially in our small market, by the time it came out, you had enough orders to pay the printer and the binder and whatnot. It really didn't require capital. And the credit card company was just the opposite. If you were successful, you needed more equipment. You needed more time to finance the cycle from when you got an order to when you collected the accounts receivables. So it took a tremendous amount of cash. And my father, he was dead set against all this by then, because he was 70 or so by then, and he didn't see any reason to take any chance like this. So this to me was my company that I could, either succeed or fail in. And every year I would show him, the financial reports, and every year it would make money, but it would lose cash. And every year he would say to me, how long are you going to keep throwing money down this rat hole? And so eventually, he passed away in 1988, and the situation was pretty much the same. The book company would make cash, it would go into the credit card company, and the next year they just needed more. But they were always very profitable, but not cash profitable. And every year he complained about it. This is insanity. And so finally, I guess I sold it about 4 years after he died. And of course, then everything turned to cash. And I think it just gave me a good feeling, because I think with that company, I sort of had the same experience that he had with the book company. And it sort of erased my feeling of, I was just someone who came along later, and it was easy to be successful or to make it bigger and better, where he had done the real heavy digging.
Well, it sounds like you've had a very interesting life yourself. Your father certainly did in his time. And I want to thank you, Paul Rothman, for sharing so much with us today about yourself, the company, your family, and some of the other characters
Right.
in the business.
Well, thank you. It's
Uh,
been fun for me too.
I like to give the individual being interviewed an opportunity to have the last word. Is there anything that you want to add, or have we pretty well covered the waterfront, so to speak?
Well, I think we pretty much have. Do you have anything else?
No, you
No?
have gone
Okay.
through virtually everything that I had in mind, and it's been a fun trip down memory lane, and I think our viewers will enjoy this video.
Well, good. Thanks you for giving me this opportunity.